welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's jump right in to study some Jewish history together. So the aftermath of the Six-Day War and the euphoria that it sent throughout the whole entire Jewish world was very short-lived, because while it was a great 6 days and it seemed like it was going to lead to so many good things, there were definitely some good things that came out of it, but in many ways, in a long-term macro perspective, there were just a long list of missed opportunities. We mentioned a lot of the good that came out of it last week. Of course, the uniting of Jerusalem was huge. Having the Golan Heights as a security advantage was huge. And the Kiruv movement, the Jewish outreach movement that was spawned of thousands of Jews returning to their Jewish heritage, that was huge. But beyond that list, there were many missed opportunities. Now, one other thing we didn't touch on too much last week, but really started in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, not totally connected to it, but partially connected to it, was the beginning of Russian Jews to be emancipated from communist Russia. Now, it's an interesting situation because the Jews living in Russia at this point have been living under communist rule for 50 years, where religion was basically illegal, and yet they still had a Jewish flicker burning inside of them and a desire to be Jewish and connect to their Judaism. And in 1970, there was a hijacking where nine Soviet Jews who refused exit of the Soviet Union, because that's what we called them, refuseniks, because to be able to leave the Soviet Union, you had to apply, and they were refused, therefore they were called refuseniks. So there were 9 refuseniks in 1970 who were convicted of hijacking a Russian civilian airliner in Leningrad, and the plan was dubbed Operation Wedding. Now, after the Six-Day War, Russia broke off diplomatic relations with Israel, and the already terrible situation for the Jews within the Soviet Union became completely untenable. And therefore, it led a group of Jews within Russia to finally try and make something happen. So this Operation Wedding was that 16 refuseniks bought up all the seats on a 12-seater plane under the guise that they were going to a wedding. And just before takeoff, they would expel the pilots and take off from Sweden, take off for Sweden, and their eventual freedom where they could go on out of the Soviet Union. When they arrived at the airport, the KGB arrested them all because they had figured out exactly what was going on. Well, now, while those caught were tried, found guilty of high treason, and there was an initial crackdown on Jewish activity within the Soviet Union, so the untenable situation became really impossible. What it did was it brought international attention to the human rights violations against the Jews throughout the Soviet Union, and it led to a temporary loosening of immigration from 1960 to 1970. Whereas, just to compare the decades, from 1960 to 1970, only 4,000 exit visas were granted, and in the 10 years following, from 1970 to 1980, there were 400,000 exit visas granted, and the majority of those were to Jews. So this was a situation that really sort of broke through the Iron Curtain in a certain way, that before that point, Jews really couldn't get out. We mentioned before the Soviets would trickle a little bit into Israel to blackmail the Arabs, but from the decade of 1970 to 1980, we see that 400,000, mostly Jews, are able to get out of the Soviet Union, and that's the beginning of really the fall of the Iron Curtain and the fall of what will end up being hundreds of thousands of Jews getting out of the Soviet Union. Now, right after the Six-Day War, in fact, 3 months later, there was a meeting of the Arab League where they proclaimed the infamous 3 no's. No recognition, no negotiation, and no peace. That meant that all the members of the Arab League all the member nations of the Arab League were bound by this pact, so to speak, that they could not negotiate, they could not recognize, and they could not have peace with Israel. Now, this was reminiscent of John Kerry's 3 no's, where he later said no, that there won't be a separate peace between Israel and other Arab nations, that they had to deal with the Palestinian problem first, and that's essentially what the Arab League was saying. Obviously, that was broken during the last 2 years, with the Abraham Accords, but be it as it may, those 3 no's really stood on the books from 1967 until 1977, when Egypt would broker a deal with Israel, and then later Jordan, and then not again until the Abraham Accords. But coming out of the Six-Day War, all the Arab nations said these 3 no's: no negotiation, no peace, no recognition. recognition, or no negotiation, no recognition, no peace, in whatever order you want to put it. Now, after the war, Israel right away began settling the Golan Heights because they realized what a strategic advantage this gave them, and how before, Syria was just constantly shelling them from the heights, and therefore they, I don't want to say they never had intention to give the Golan Heights back, because there are many debates about giving back the Golan Heights, but you have to remember, the Golan Heights were only controlled by Syria for 19 years, and out of all the neighbors to Israel, Israel's always known that Syria would probably be the last on the list to call, so Israel right away began settling the Golan Heights and putting military installations up there and making it really into the Golan Heights that we see today. Jerusalem was right away settled because there was no intention to ever get back Jerusalem. The Mandelbaum Gate was torn down, the no man's land between East and West Jerusalem was torn up, and Israel began to build up the old city. By the way, when you walk in the old city today, even though it looks like an ancient city, everything you see in the Jewish quarter is no more than 45 years old. It's all post-67 war, it's all post the Six-Day War, because the Jewish quarter was totally destroyed, or most of it was totally destroyed in the wars, 48 war, a little bit in the 67 war, and it was completely rebuilt after the 67 war. The Kotel plazas we see it today didn't exist. There were Arab homes going all the way up to the Kotel, and even though, like I said, it's built to look like an ancient city, it's really a 45-year-old city. But beyond just the old city, Israel worked to build up the neighborhoods all around the old city in order to, so to speak, show that there was a full intention of this being part of Israel forever. And that's where we see the neighborhoods of Ramat Eshkol, the neighborhoods of the Mamila area, French Hill, all those different neighborhoods that were built up in the wake of the Six-Day War to show Israel's dominionship over Jerusalem. Now, this was always a thorn in the side of many administrations in America because, especially during the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, they would talk about a settlement freeze. And according to at least Obama's definition, settlements included anything beyond the 67 lines, the 67 borders, and therefore, according to them, building in Jerusalem, building anywhere in Jerusalem, and was building over the, in settled area, and settlements, so to speak, in occupied territories. Obviously, by Israel standards, that was never part of the discussion, and these parts were annexed by Israel right away. Jerusalem, Ma'ale Adumim, these parts became Israel right away. There's no discussion of them giving them back. It's never been discussion of giving them back. Israel would not give them back. Now, that remained true at least until Ehud Barak comes to power, but that is even Ehud Barak never talked about giving back the old city. He just talked about giving back parts of East Jerusalem. But be it as it may, that's what happens in the wake of the Six-Day War. Now, another thing that happened from 48 to 67, the 42 synagogues within the old city of Jerusalem were destroyed by the Jordanians, including the famous Horva Shul was destroyed for a second time. After the 67 war, that arch was put up that lasted from 67 or whatever year it was built. I don't know if it was built right away, but right around 67 until 2002, I believe it was, when the fallen Horva Shul was finally rebuilt to look like its original shul, and is now an amazing landmark within the old city of Jerusalem. Now, Israel did not touch Judea and Samaria, for the most part, did not touch the quote-unquote West Bank, because they thought that the first ones to call was going to be King Hussein in Jordan, and therefore they intended to give it back to Jordan. By the way, again, at this point, no one's talking about a Palestinian state. The PLO, even though they exist already, it's not even a discussion. The plan and the thought was that the West Bank would be held as a trump card, a card to be given back to the Jordanians with a peace deal. And Israel really thought Jordan was going to be the first one to call. Now, the one exception to this was the Etzion Bloc. The Etzion Bloc was an area that was settled pre-48. These are the areas of Efrat, Gush Etzion, the Kfar Etzion, Kibbutz Kfar Etzion, and it was a Jewish area before the 48 war. It fell actually before the 48 war and some of the pre-war skirmishes, the part of the independence war that took place before May 48, and the descendants of those who lived in the Etzion Bloc went back to settle it after the 67 war when it was reconquered. Hebron ended up being given back to the Arabs by Netanyahu, but the Jewish quarter of Hebron definitely was reinvigorated at this point, we'll say, or repopulated at this point after the 67 war. At this point, the PLO, which we mentioned last week, was established in 1964 when Egypt was in the Sinai, Jordan was in the West Bank, and Syria was in the Golan Heights. So, it's very clear what they wanted wanted to liberate, because they weren't talking about liberating Arab lands. But at this point now, it's under the control of Yasser Arafat. And the really Yamach Shemo V'Zichron, one of the greatest terrorists ever to live on the world stage. He was actually, even though he always walked around with his 5 o'clock shadow, or really 5-day shadow, I should say, in his military outfit and looking disgruntled, looking, like he was not so wealthy. He was, I think, the 7th wealthiest world leader when he was alive. Totally corrupt, total terrorist, total liar to the world and the international body. But at this point now, he is in charge of the PLO, and he's really the one who, in many ways, creates terrorism in the world. Terrorism, as we know, it doesn't exist before this point, but the PLO really ramps up their idea of the felachin, the idea of their terrorist attacks. At this point, they're mainly in refugee camps in Jordan. PLO is stationed in Jordan at this point, and in the wake of the 6 Day War, we'll have what's called the War of Attrition. Now, the War of Attrition, for the most part, it's never considered a full-scale war, but in many ways it was. We're going to see the casualties that came through it, and the War of Attrition, really the main front was the Sinai, and it was led by Nasser in Egypt, and it went from March 8th, 1969. I'm sorry, that's actually before the 6 Day War, so it really started technically before the 6 Day War, but it goes till well after the 6 Day War for another year, until Nixon and Kissinger, or Nixon and his Secretary of State before Kissinger broker the ceasefire on that. But the War of Attrition takes place on the Sinai front, also takes place on the Jordanian front, and the main ones fighting on the Jordanian front are the PLO. This is the beginning of the PLO terrorist attacks that they are so famous for, or infamous for, and it starts at this time, and we'll see what ends up happening. We'll see what ends up happening with that. But and by the way, the Syrians would also shell from wherever they could shell from. So you had really a 3-front war for this War of Attrition as well. But again, with the main hostilities being over the Suez, over the Sinai Peninsula, in the Sinai Peninsula, over the Suez. And what would happen was Egypt would shell over the canal, and Israel would retaliate with airstrikes, and through this war of attrition, there were about 600 Israelis that were killed, about 10,000 Egyptians were killed, 200 Egyptian planes were shot down compared to 25 Israeli planes. The PLO suffered about 2,000 casualties and 2,500 captured, and an estimated 300 Jordanians and 500 Syrians were also killed. By the way, there are also Cuban forces on the Syrian front that were deployed, and there were an estimated 200 killed and 250 wounded of those Cuban soldiers in Syria. So, if you ever asked a history or trivia question, what South American power attacked Israel? You could probably guess if there was one, it was Cuba, but yes, the answer was Cuba. Cuba was involved in the War of Attrition and attacking Israel. Now, during this War of Attrition, there was a battle known as the Battle of Kerama. Now, Kerama was a city in Jordan that had several PLO military installments, and it was a battle where it was a tactical victory for Israel because they were able to destroy the military camps, the military installments. But the Arabs, the PLO, together with Jordanians, also claimed victory because Arafat was not captured. There were high casualties sustained for both sides, and Israel was also not able to retrieve 3 dead soldiers that were left behind, and there were several damaged Israeli vehicles and tanks that were later paraded in Amman by the Jordan military. So this was looked at as a psychological win for the Jordanian army and the PLO. But what it did really was it came back to really haunt the PLO in a major way. The Jordanians in a major way, because it really strengthened the PLO within the eyes of the Arab world. The Arab world finally looked at the PLO as a force to be reckoned with at this point, and the Fedayeen began to speak openly about overthrowing the Hashemite Empire in Jordan and taking over all of Jordan before they took over Israel. And the tensions led to many tensions between the Jordanian authorities and the PLO, and it ended up culminating in what was known as Black September in 1970. Now, Black September in 1970 was repeal of terrorists.
I don't know that one.
where the PLO terrorists were really, at this point, a state within Jordan. And they had already had assassination attempts on King Hussein. And they hijacked a number of aircrafts, and they landed at Dawson's Field within Jordan, which was an abandoned airfield, and that was on the 6th of September. And they came into the hostage crisis came to a head with the Jordanians. Now the PLO later blew up these planes in front of the international press, and Hussein just saw this whole thing as the last straw. So he sent the Jordanian army in on the PLO. They ended up relieving the hostage crisis. By the way, one of the most famous hostages was none other than Reb Yitzchak Hutner, the Pachet Yitzchak, the Rosh Hashiva of Yeshivas Chaim Berlin. He was on one of those planes and was taken a hostage at that point. And the Jordanians broker a deal with the PLO, where the PLO had to leave Jordan, and they let them leave via Syria to Lebanon. And so from this point on, from September 1970 until the early 80s, until the first Lebanon War, the PLO will be stationed in Lebanon. So, at this point, the PLO has their original home from 64 to 70 in Jordan, and now they make their way via Syria to Lebanon, where they will have their war from 1970 until 1982, I believe, at the time of the first Lebanon War. So it's interesting that initially the PLO and Jordan are really fighting together against Israel, but ultimately it becomes too much for the Hashemite Empire, for King Hussein, and they're banished from Jordan after the Black September uprising. Now, after this point, there's a subset of the PLO that's established called the Black September Organization, and they would carry out a number of terrorist attacks and reprisals against the Jordanian authorities. They killed the Jordanian Prime Minister Wasif Tal in 1971, and their most infamous attack was in 1972 at the Munich Olympic Games. Now, this was, of course, the infamous attack where there were 9 Israeli Olympians that were taken hostage by the Black September members, and there were 2 that were actually killed right away. So in the end, in a botched hostage rescue by the Germans, they ended up, all the 9 hostages were killed, making a total of 11 Israeli casualties. And the whole thing was just a debacle, because West Germany was not prepared in any way for the Olympics. The Israelis had already expressed concerns with the lack of security at Olympic Village. Already throughout the Olympics, the curfew was not being enforced by security. The different athletes were able to go walk freely and jump fences from one part of the compound to the other. The terrorists were part of the work detail of the Olympic compound, and even when it came time at the terrorist attack, the army couldn't even intervene, because the West German Constitution said that the West German army cannot act in the country of Germany during peacetime. So this was considered peacetime, so it was left to the Munich police and the Bavarian police to try and put down this hostage crisis, which they did a terrible job of, and all the hostages ended up being tragically murdered by their Black September Palestinian captors. Now, the interesting twist of history, that the head of the head of the Black September group that perpetrated the attack was the son of a Christian father and an Jewish mother. So technically, the head of this Black September cell that carried out the Munich attack was halachically Jewish. Just one of those strange twists of world and Jewish history. But this was, the terrorist attacks that were going on in the world thanks to the PLO. And for many, they felt like, this was a throwback to the Middle Ages. They thought that they were past all this stuff, that, this wasn't going to happen anymore. And here it was all over again, happening throughout this war of attrition, through the terrorist war being carried out throughout the world of the PLO. Now, with the Israelis in the Sinai now for the 3rd time, they were there as part of the 48 War. Britain made them leave. They were there as part of the Suez Crisis, and America made them leave, and now they're there again. And at this point, no one's going to force them to leave. Definitely, America's not forcing them to leave. No one's forcing them to leave. So the question was, what to do with it. So Israel made the decision to colonize it, because there were many positive aspects of the Sinai, not just a huge swath of land, but there were many positive aspects of the Sinai for the Israelis. First of all, oil was discovered in the Morgan oil field. field. The Egyptians claim that they discovered it before 67, but it's not true because the major producing discovery did not come until 1969, and it came by the Israelis. It was a military buffer, a huge military buffer between the Israelis and the Egyptians, and therefore Israel puts many air bases in the Sinai, and they make on the now the Sinai-Egyptian border, which is now the Israeli-Egyptian border, they make what's called the Bar-Lev line, which really is in many ways a reincarnation of the Maginot Line of World War II in France, and it was about as effective as we'll see at the onset of World War II, the onset of the Yom Kippur War, because it proves to be completely ineffective and it falls into disrepair by 73. But this is what Israel does with the Sinai, and they colonize it with people. They make a neighborhood by the name of Yamit, and that's a popular was a settlement of Jews within the Sinai. And when Israel has to eventually give back the Sinai in the 80s after the peace deal with Egypt, it's not very easy. It's reminiscent of when the disengagement of Gaza that we many of us witnessed from Ariel Sharon, and it was very similar then because the Jews did not want to give up their home in the Sinai. So this is sort of the landscape of this war of attrition that goes on, that's going on, and it ends up being really, even though it's not considered a major war, it was in many ways considered a terrible war with all the casualties and everything that happened. Nixon will broker a peace deal a ceasefire, not a peace deal, a ceasefire. And what the Israelis gain from this is, as part of the ceasefire, America finally agrees to sell arms and sell planes to Israel. So from 48 to 70, America won't sell to Israel, and finally in 70 that begins the relationship, the military relationship of America and Israel that goes on until this very day. We're going to see how instrumental that plays in the Yom Kippur War. Now, 1970, Nasser dies of a heart attack. And that was also a strategic move, a strategic event, I should say, in the Arab world, because he was already the loser twice against Israel, and he would not run back to war so quickly because he had already failed twice to have any successful military involvement against Israel. And one of his deputies by the name of Anwar Sadat takes over. Now, Sadat was basically a no-name to the international community, and many people thought he was just a placeholder until the next strong man could come into power. But he's going to prove to have really fooled everybody and prove to be someone who could really maneuver his way out of almost any situation and make a situation where Egypt could come out on top, and that's what he's going to end up doing. And he's going to really surprise the world in a major way with his true cunning and his ability to really make a difference in the world. Now, Russia is involved in rearming Egypt in a major way, and really Sadat's goal is really Nasser's goal before him, and definitely it's Sadat's goal is to be able to conquer the Sinai by any means possible. So he did not have the same fear of war as Nasser had, because first of all, he hadn't lost twice like Nasser had, and second of all, he felt that the stalemate had to be shaken up. At this point, from 67 to 70, nothing had happened. The war of attrition didn't get anywhere. Nasser had hoped the war of attrition would at least push Israel back off of the Suez, and to lead to hopefully an eventual withdrawal of Israel from the Suez altogether. That didn't happen, and therefore Sadat was looking just to do something to shake up the situation. Beyond this, Israel was suffering from a tremendous hubris, because throughout the whole war of attrition and their response to all the terrorist attacks of the PLO, it just led this sense of military invincibility that Israel had after the 48 war, the 56 war, the 67 war, and therefore for the first and hopefully the only time, the hubris of Israel starts to get to the country just a little bit. Beyond that, it's very expensive to mobilize a reservist army. In Israel, Golda Meir, who was the prime minister at this time, she had already mobilized the army a few times, and at the cost of several $1 million. And they couldn't respond to every threat so quickly. So unfortunately, they kind of misread the impeding Yom Kippur War, and they don't mobilize until now. They do finally get intelligence and finally respond after the 10th red flag, the morning of Yom Kippur. So the Israeli army does mobilize before the actual attack, but they were just completely unprepared for what was coming, for the joint coordinated attack of both the Egyptians and the Syrians. Now, The other factor that we're going to see plays into this is that at this point the world is completely already began their addiction or their reliance on Middle Eastern oil, and we're going to see how that will play in. That will play into the situation as the war progresses and the post-war situation happens. Now Egypt was prepared to lose. They really didn't think they could beat Israel, and their plan was to get at least a third of the way in to the Sinai and then wait for whatever retaliation was to come. Now, part of the hubris just leading up to the war was that there was a situation where Syria had violated Israeli airspace, and 13 Syrian planes were shot down. So, like in 5 minutes, they lose 13 planes. So this is really the situation. Now, one of the big debacles is everyone thought the Bar-Lev line on the Egyptian-Israeli border was going to protect against anything, but going into Yom Kippur, it was severely undermanned. Many of its installments had fallen into disrepair, and therefore the Egyptians, when they finally attack on Yom Kippur morning, they just literally blow through it like a sand dune, put their pontoon boats on the Suez, and come over and attack into the Sinai. And the defenses just aren't there to stop them at that point. Now, to add to the what leads to the difficulty is we talked about last week. A lot of, or really most of the success of the 6-Day War came because Israel had their preemptive strike to totally knock out the Egyptian Air Force before the war even started, at the beginning of the war. Now, Henry Kissinger, who at this point is Secretary of State of America, he had warned Israel very sternly. Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan had requested several times to have a preemptive stack and to sort of be clear with America. And at this point, America, as we said, was supplying arms to Israel, and Henry Kissinger, the Jew on Yom Kippur, makes it very clear to Israel that if Israel struck first, they would not even receive as much as a nail from America. Kissinger. We could say a lot about Kissinger. There's a lot to say about him. Many ways a self-hating or even self-loathing Jew. But just to one of the famous interactions between Kissinger and Golda Meir was that Kissinger, when he met Golda Meir, I think for the first time, says to her, Golda, I'm an American first, a Secretary of State second, and a Jew third. Or maybe it was Secretary of State first, American second, and Jew third. I forget which way he said it. But Golda Meir responds, Henry, that in Israel we read from right to left. So, that was her response to that. Now, another interesting thing is we call it the Yom Kippur War. The Muslims call it the Ramadan War because it was not only on Yom Kippur when the war broke out, but it was also during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. And people in shuls across the world started to find out about it, and let's say in the non-from shuls is a little bit easier, but in the Orthodox shuls, the janitors and the non-Jewish staff came in and told the Jews, and people didn't know what to do with themselves. Now, the information that came on the first day, unlike the 6-Day War, where it was the negative information coming out from Nasser that was lies, here the information no one knew what to believe, and the terrible severity of the sneak attack was not being broadcasted on international news, but it was terrible. The Syrians went with 450 tanks to maybe 7 Israeli tanks on the Golan at that time. They went well into the halfway through the Golan Heights. There were upwards of 100 planes lost to Russian rockets, and it was just the first few days were just the first 3-4 days were military debacle. Dayan almost had a nervous breakdown. The military minister, and he said at that time, "Zehu HaChorban Hashlishi." This is going to be the third destruction, referring to that we had the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, the first temple, the second temple, and he said this will be the third destruction of Israel. And but in the end, slowly but surely, Israel is able to turn the tides. They're able to end up, after Egypt makes it well into the Sinai, they're able to, through just daring attacks, the daring mission of Ariel Sharon, where he's able to cross the Suez and they're able to encircle the Egyptian Third Army. The Syrians up in the north thought the whole thing was a trap, so they paused for a day. That gave the Israelis enough time to catch up, and slowly but surely Israel is able to push back. They push the Egyptians out of the Sinai. They push the Syrians back out of the Golan Heights. They start shelling Damascus. They get within 10 to 15 miles of Damascus. They get within a few tens of miles of Cairo, and they're really back to even a stronger position at the end of the war than they were than they were at the end of the 6-Day War. Now, in the psyche, the Arabs remember the beginning of the war when they had the initial success, and the Jews remember the end of the war. But if you remember the war as a total, it was really a terrible war on both sides because there were tremendous casualties on both sides. It showed that the Israelis were not as unbeatable as they had led themselves to believe that they were. It's going to be a tremendous nick in their shield, but it's going to give the Arabs enough save face, so to speak, that we're going to see next week. It's going to lead that Sadat can actually now come to the table because of his the little bit of saved face that the Arabs had due to the beginning of the war. Now, as a response to the war, because really beyond the war being another Arab-Israeli conflict, it was another stage of the Cold War, and because America was now officially supporting Israel, and it led the two nuclear powers almost to the brink of war themselves, and eventually they'll get off of that stalemate through Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, but it was definitely a tremendous stage of the Cold War. But beyond that, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, aka OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, after the war wanted to retaliate against the countries that supported Israel. So the oil boycott came about, and oil prices go through the roof. American oil prices go through the roof. Gas prices go through the roof. Gas becomes hard to come by, and you can imagine what that does to many of the Americans throughout the coastal plains of America, the Midwest, the West Coast, where they've never met a Jew. And all of a sudden, the reason they can't afford gas for their truck, for their 50-mile trek to work, is because of something going on in the Sinai. Like, they don't care about Sinai or Jew or anything. And you can imagine what that does for the world opinion of the Jew because of what caused this thing. So initially, it doesn't solve anything. The PLO will still be out of their terrorist attacks, but this will be really what Sadat was looking for, which was really a break in the stalemate. And it's going to lead him to the point within 5 years, where we'll talk about next week, where he will come to Israel, he'll speak before the Knesset, we'll have the Camp David Accords, and a peace between Egypt and Israel, which we will talk about, God willing, next week. I look forward to discussing it with you. And until that point, have a wonderful week.